there's a number of tariffs still on canola, some canola products. There's still tariffs on Canadian pork products. You said you have this new partnership with China, that there's going to be no more games if we let in 50,000 Chinese EVs. The other thing is this previous agreement on the canola tariffs expires at the end of this year.
Welcome back to Northern Perspective, everybody. We are here live, not live to you, but live to us from the riding of Foothills. And we have a very special MP with us today. And they're special because they're really focusing on a portfolio that, in our opinion, especially since being in Alberta, does not get enough attention. He is the Shadow Minister for Agriculture. John Barlow, welcome to Northern Perspective.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a real honor to be here with both of you.
Thank you. Well, before we get into any difficult questions, why don't we just start off with, so you're born and raised in Alberta. What drew you to politics and how did you get into this?
Well, for more than 20 years, I was involved with community newspapers in Alberta, and I was the regional editor of about 5 in Southwest Alberta. So I've covered politics at every level for 2 decades and always been interested in it, obviously, from a different perspective of it. Now, we were the good media. We were the small town community papers that actually reported the real news and unbiased, and I just wanted to let people know what was going on in our communities. And then when the position of the Member of Parliament became available, when my predecessor, Ted Menzies, who was an incredible member, resigned, forced a by-election, and I just had a number of people come to me and say, people trust you, they know who you are, you've told their stories, we think you should do this, you'd be really good at it. Initially, to be honest, I said no, I don't want to be away that much, but my wife, being much smarter than I, she said, you know what, people are right, you will be good at this, and if you don't do it, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. And she was right. It's been an incredible experience so far.
Amazing. And what's your favorite part about being an MP?
The best part is, yesterday we had a group of people from the United Nations and FAO from, Rome, New York, Indiana, and I took them through my riding. We want to teach them show them about ranching, and just the opportunity to showcase where we live and the people who I represent. I am so proud of Southern Albertans and what we represent, and just the opportunity to meet these people and work with them. I think that's my favorite part.
One of the things that we have come to realize since visiting Alberta, this is my, I think, total of 3rd or 4th time in the province, but it's really my first time being able to actually travel within the province and see everything. Farming is such a staple here. You cannot go virtually anywhere, drive in any direction without seeing farms, and it is probably one of the most beautiful sights that you can see out here. It's just farms and life and cultivation as far as you can see in almost every direction. What is it about farming and ranching in Alberta that really came to be such a cornerstone of the economy out here, aside from obviously oil and gas?
Right. I think it really epitomizes of who we are as Albertans, that we want to be self-reliant, we're entrepreneurs, but it really is who we are, that connection to the land. Whether you're doing crops or cattle or any other commodity we're doing, there's just that connection. You have to think of 150 years ago when people were coming out west and literally breaking this ground and building something that we are very proud of. And I think as Albertans, all we ask for is to be respected for that and that contribution. We're happy to do our part. We just want to be respected for doing that.
What made farming in Alberta in the prairies it has been here for hundreds of years. Why is farming so prevalent here, just for Canadians that may not know?
Well, it's, we have an interesting mix. If you're going down, you're kind of splitting Alberta in two. If you look to the west, you have the amazing foothills and the native grassland. So this native grassland was grazed for hundreds, if not thousands of years by millions of bison that has made this, just an incredible carbon sequestration, but incredible landscape. So it's just absolutely perfect for ranching, raising livestock. You go to the east and you have this incredible flat prairie land, which we've turned into incredible cash crops that whether that's wheat, barley, canola, certainly now peas and pulses are becoming a really big commodity out here as well. So you kind of see that really interesting diversity on the west side compared to the east, but they seem to mesh really quite well.
Now, for farmers, there's farmers and ranchers. They're two different different things.
Unless you're in Ontario, they're beef farmers, but out here they're ranchers.
Right. So for farmers, they're talked a lot by politicians in Ottawa, but do you find that they're not often listened to enough in Ottawa?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's one of the biggest differences that you see from when we were in government with Prime Minister Harper to the last 11 years of a Liberal government, where when we were in government, agriculture was a priority. It had a seat at the cabinet table, so to speak, where decisions that were made, especially when Jerry Ritz was the minister, you had a really strong, influential voice at the cabinet table. That just has not been the case for the last 11 years. And you just look at the people who have, whether it's Trudeau put in as agriculture minister, Lawrence McCauley, Bibeau, certainly people that weren't, fire and going to be out there defending the Canadian farmer. So that's really what we've been missing. And you've seen a lot of the issues that farmers and ranchers are having to deal with over the last number of years. Lots of announcements and say, yes, we understand, but not very many solutions.
If you could narrow down the single most important issue that I'll make it simple, that Alberta farmers are dealing with, what would that issue be?
I think that, really it's hard to nail one, but I think the two that would be the highest, top priorities would be the high input costs, fuel, fertilizer, those types of things that are making farming economically unviable right now. That would be the biggest challenge. There's certain things we can control. You can't control commodity prices, you can't control the weather, but there are some things that we can control. And that's to ensure that they have a competitive regulatory and tax regime. And that is certainly missing. And the other thing is a little bit more closer to home, and I think that's for farmers across the country, is that succession planning. Our average farmer is close to 60 years old. That's right across the country. We're going to see over the next 2 decades a mass transition. And the big concern is that next generation see agriculture and food production as a viable career opportunity. Is that something they want to get into? But you have to buy that farm operation from mom and dad or aunt and uncle or grandma and grandpa. It's tough to ask them to go into, start a business with millions of dollars in debt. So those two things, I think, are two things that we really have to try to address to ensure that we have a long-term viable agriculture industry in Canada.
Are the land prices becoming like exorbitant out here as they are in Ontario, where if you do have someone who wants to buy a farm from, as you said, a family member, that they're not able to because the prices are just so outrageous?
Certainly, that is a big part of that succession planning issue, is taking on those land costs. We aren't to the point where Ontario and BC are, but in perspective, certainly it's difficult. And when you are competing with very large landholders, or now we're seeing a lot of foreign investment, or pension plans, like the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan is buying up a significant amount of agriculture land, is making it very difficult for that family farm to be able to compete on. When it comes to when a neighboring farm comes up for sale, are they going to be able to make a competitive offer? So those are definitely a part of that succession planning that we have to try and find a way to address. You don't want to push land prices down or have government intervention, but are there some tools, like I said, through succession planning, tax credits, capital gains exemptions, things like that, that'll make that easier for that next generation to get started?
Now, do you find that farming, like the trades over the last, I would say, 20, 25 years, has really been pushed off of the career map for most young people? Because I went to high school in a farming town in Lindsay, Ontario, and there was a lot of cattle around there, a lot of crop farms around there. But going through the high school system, the question was always, all right, what university are you going to go to, and what tech degree are you going to get, or what non-farming, non-trade related degree are you going to get? So it's almost from the beginning through the school system that farming is invisible to people, other than here's a book, here's a cow, and here's a farm. But they were never encouraged to go into that type of career. Do you think that is playing a role in this disconnect even between parents and their children in terms of carrying on the legacy of the farm?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's interesting. I think what we're trying to do is show those young people that being involved in agriculture and food production isn't necessarily meaning you have to go on the farm. It doesn't mean you have to get the coveralls and get your hands dirty. There are incredible opportunities on the science and research side, innovation, whether that's, AI, drones, all of that technology side. There are incredible opportunities. In fact, I think employment opportunities in agriculture is one of the fastest growing in Canada. So it's not just having to be on the farm. There's lots of other opportunities there. I think what we're seeing most of the time is that next generation is going off to university, getting that degree, and whatever that may be, and then eventually coming back to the farm. But they're also bringing that new education, those new ideas, that new energy with them. And that's why you're seeing, I think, in agriculture, especially in Canada, that willingness to embrace those new ideas and that new technology, whether that's agronomy, GPS technologies, satellite imaging, all of these things that are making us more efficient and certainly increasing production, doing more with less. And I don't think we would have that success if it wasn't for that younger generation bringing those ideas where, certainly my generation would be like, Grandpa's always done it this way and we will never change. And we're really seeing some exciting things happening in agriculture right now.
And when it comes to the continued viability of farming, how does the industrial carbon tax play into that?
Well, again, that big question, the government always likes to talk about environmental sustainability, which kind of drives me bonkers because that's something we've been always doing. Regenerative agriculture is not new. It is something that is, fundamental to a successful agriculture operation. But you can't be environmentally sustainable if you're not economically viable. And having these increased costs like the industrial carbon tax, which continues to drive up costs, whether that's fertilizer, fuel, machinery, all of the things that a farmer relies on, those are the things he can't control. So when we're asking farmers, again, to do more with less, they can't be competitive if their costs are making that out of control. So when you have a 35% tariff on fertilizer imports, you have an industrial carbon tax, you have a clean fuel standard, all of these things are adding up costs on the farmer, which no matter how you slice it, eventually ends up increasing the costs of those commodities when they get to the grocery store shelf.
But the Liberals will tell you, and they will tell Canadians, that this is an imaginary tax.
For sure.
And that farmers are exempt from the industrial carbon tax. Is some of that true? Is none of that true? Or, we're not inside Parliament. Are they flat out lying to Canadians?
Well, I think they learned a lesson. I'll give the Liberals a little bit of credit here in that when they canceled the consumer carbon tax, I think what they realized is why there was such a political pain point for them is it was on receipts. People saw what they were paying. And eventually people saw those costs continue to increase. So when they say, well, we got rid of the consumer carbon tax, there's no more carbon tax. What they did with the industrial carbon tax is they've replaced the consumer carbon tax, but that is not on your receipt. So you don't know what you're paying. So they can hide it. So to say that, any business would say, if you're increasing my costs, that is going to increase the cost of the product I produce. I would love for them to show me any business that is just going to absorb those increases in taxes. No one is going to. What makes the industrial carbon tax that much more painful, and what the Liberals mislead you or kind of lie to you about, is this hits every single point in the supply chain. When the farmer buys fertilizer, when he buys seed, when he buys machinery, when he transports those products by rail, by truck, by whatever, when it's processed, produced, packaged, that industrial carbon tax hits on every single aspect of food production. So of course, when it gets to the store shelf, all of that is going to be compounded. And that's why you see in Canada, we have the highest food inflation in the G7. And that is why Canadians are struggling at the grocery store. That's the facts, and the Liberals don't like those facts.
Why in particular is beef coming from Alberta more expensive now than it had been in the past?
The biggest thing is the size of the cattle herd. It is supply and demand. And because we've had droughts, for the last 5 years, our cattle herd is probably the lowest it's been since the early 1980s. The same situation in the United States. Now we've seen cattle prices really start to rise, but it's not to the point where producers are willing to start growing that herd and buying back in. They want to see if this is going to continue for a year. If we have great rain this summer, is that going to kind of replenish that water table? I think once you start seeing the producers buying and increasing the herd numbers, we'll start to see those beef prices start to settle down. But the other issue, obviously, in Canada is we have two main processors in Cargill and JBS. Not a ton of competition there. we were really pushing for the elimination of interprovincial trade barriers to increase that competition.
But John, Mark Carney said he's eliminated all of them.
Right, he did, except in C5, he exempted food from the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. So all of these things that we talk about moving food commodities across interprovincial boundaries, and when they say we now have this Canadian Free Trade Agreement, what they don't tell you is they exempted all food products from that free trade agreement. So those and irritants are still there.
So we have the industrial carbon tax, we have tariffs. Mark Carney was able to somewhat resolve the canola tariffs that were on farmers
Some.
by selling our soul to the Chinese EV industry, but that's a different industry.
Yeah.
But he had come out and said to Canadians that, well, we now have a strategic partnership with China, the biggest threat to Canada's security.
Right.
But that's another conversation. But we just saw China slap a 75% tariff on Canada again. So what does that say to Canadians about this stable and more predictable strategic partnership?
Well, I think anyone who tries to profess that they have a stable relationship with China is lying to you. That's never happened, and it will never happen. But this again just goes to the hypocrisy of the Liberals, where they say one thing and the results are actually completely different once you start digging in. Even when he said, I've eliminated all these tariffs, 8 months ago, there's a number of tariffs still on canola, some canola products. There's still tariffs on Canadian pork products. And now to say that we have that 75% tariff on pea starch, even if the amount of pea starch that we export to China isn't huge, it's the principle. You said you have this new partnership with China, that there's going to be no more games if we let in 50,000 Chinese EVs. The other thing is this previous agreement on the canola tariffs expires at the end of this year. So there's no long-term commitment, no long-term guarantee that those tariffs will be removed. As a farmer, you were making plans years in advance on what my crop rotation is, what seed I'm going to buy. Am I going to expand my farm? Am I going to buy another quarter section or rent another half section? So for farmers, they're like, what's going to happen next? Do I buy canola seed this year or do I not? And now with this new pea tariff, you kind of have to question, like, is there really any relationship that's there? In the meantime, he is irritating our most important partner, which is the United States, where 70% of our agriculture products are traded one way or another with that country. So we are doing everything, Carney's doing everything he can to poke Trump in the eye, cozying up to China, which has proven over and over again to be an unreliable trading partner.
So with the tariffs that the Chinese put on pea starch, their argument is that we've been dumping pea starch into their economy. Is that a fair argument? Do you think that that they're misleading, the world and Canada on what they're saying? What do you think about their argument for that tariff?
Oh, this is just gamesmanship by China. This is nothing new. They've done this with canola in the past. We've been blocked out on beef for a number of years. We're just getting beef back into China. This is a regular game that they play, and we tell all of our producers, anytime you have an agreement with China, take that with a grain of salt. It will change. So for Carney to kind of make this big proclamation, those of us who have been dealing with China for a number of years, we know that they are going to be unpredictable and they are going to press. And when they see something, an opportunity, they're going to take advantage of it, especially when you have a prime minister who is weak on these trade agreements.
So that's interesting because it seems like you're saying that China is somewhat hypocrites because we interviewed another individual a couple of days ago who was talking about the fact that China has been dumping steel or dirty steel or whatever you want to call that adjective of steel into Canada. So do you think they are hypocrites for literally dumping steel and all these other products into Canada while saying, well, you're dumping pea starch into our economy, so therefore we have to tariff at 75%?
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it, that the hypocrisy, dumping steel, they've been dumping canned vegetables into Canada as well. So we're seeing all of this, it's what's good for the goose is not necessarily good for the gander. And this is the typical game that China plays. And I guess the biggest frustration for us is the Liberals just let it happen. They turn a blind eye. And I think a big part of it is, again, you go right back to our first question, agriculture is not a priority for these guys. So if agriculture is the one paying the price and feeling the pain, they're willing to let that go.
So if the Conservatives were to take power tomorrow, what would be the new Conservative government's first priority when it comes to agriculture, when it comes to farmers across the country?
Well, again, step one would be eliminating the industrial carbon tax and the fertilizer tariffs. Again, we know that we're going to have to build an economy in Canada that is, now we're in recession, the only G20 country in recession. I kind of describe this as turning around the sinking Titanic, which is the Canadian economy. To do that, you're going to have to rely on industries that will create jobs and generate economic growth. Energy and agriculture, the critical minerals, are the three things that we have that the world wants, that the world demands. Certainly nothing more so than agriculture, that we can produce an abundance of quality, sustainable food that the world needs. Food security and food sovereignty are top two priorities globally. We can deliver that. We're happy to carry that burden. But again, you have to give farmers the tools and the resources they need to do that. And that is that competitive regulatory and tax regime and a government that's going to work with them and not against them.
And until we get to that next election, what is your message, not just to Alberta farmers, but farmers and cattle ranchers across this country, or all ranchers across this country, and also Canadians that may not fully understand the value and how necessary our farmers and ranchers are to the Canadian economy and to the Canadian food chain across the country?
Yeah, I just would encourage Canadians when they go to the grocery store shelf, just think about where that food came from. It wasn't magically produced in the back room at the grocery store. There are farm families right across this country who have chosen this lifestyle, who are dedicated to protecting our soil, improving our water, grass management. It is their livelihood and their passion to produce that food for Canadians, but not only Canadians, they are integrally helping feed the world. And that is something that we carry with a lot of pride. And again, I would hope Canadians would share that pride with us, because we do it better than anybody else in the world. And that's something that we can, that we should be a champion of, not only in our House of Commons and within government, but I think around the world. My message to farmers is, be optimistic. There are those of us who are fighting for you every possible day, and we are getting some wins. Getting strychnine for Alberta and Saskatchewan, for example, getting rid of the consumer carbon tax, getting rid of the capital gains exemption rate increase. Those are the things that we got some wins on, and we are doing that every single day to defend what you do, and we are standing with you shoulder to shoulder every day.